All right, so let's talk about quotes. How to effectively use text evidence. So, you know that there are many types of evidence out there, but in an English classroom, we want to use quotes whenever we can. Why use quotes at all? Because sometimes paraphrasing simply wouldn't do it justice. There's a lot of rich and beautiful language out there to analyze, and sometimes if you put it in your own words, you're losing some of the authenticity of that source. Remember that even if you paraphrase, you still have to cite the source because that information is still someone else's intellectual property. But whenever possible, you should try to take the direct quote and use it in your analysis. Another reason is to use quotes is when the text is essential to the essay. For example, if you're doing a literary analysis, book review, any sort of claim writing, persuasive writing, a research essay, etc. Quotes seek to provide context for an intensive analysis of a short excerpt. So if you're trying to find the main idea or a theme of the text, using a quote can be really important. They also can strengthen your argument with credible sources. Whenever you're using a quote in your writing, you want to use a quote sandwich. You don't want to just list your quotes or drop them into your writing without context. A quote sandwich starts with a lead-in phrase or sentence. Sometimes the lead-in is pretty extensive because you need to provide a lot of context for your quote. Sometimes it's just a few words that say where it came from. Regardless, the lead-in sentence needs to provide context, signal that a quote is coming, use evidential or transition words such as, for instance, for example, in fact, the text states, and then lead into the quote. The quote itself should be succinct and directly relevant to the point you're trying to prove. The word succinct means like short and sweet. You don't want to quote an entire paragraph or an entire conversation. You want to pick whatever is directly related to the question you're trying to answer. After the quote, you need to have an explanation or some sort of analysis that connects the sentence of that quote back to the point that you're trying to prove. Make it obvious why the quote you chose is significant for the reader, and move that quote from that quote to the point that you are trying to prove. When you are embedding quotes into your writing or putting them into your writing effectively, you can use three methods. Dialogue or comma quotes, introduced by words such as said, wondered, shouted, etc. These indicate conversation or thoughts by another person. We talked about dialogue quotes when we talked about narrative writing as well. They're especially effective in narrative writing, but you can also use them to put text evidence in your writing. Another way you can integrate text evidence is with a flow quote. So this is a quote that blends or naturally flows into the text around it. Finally, you can use a colon, which is introduced by a complete thought. These type of embedded quotes connect an independent clause lead-in to an independent clause quote. Here are three types of embedded quotes. First, a dialogue quote. For example, the speaker said to her son, "Life for me ain't been no crystal stair." Here, the word said indicates that someone is using dialogue or that you are integrating a quote using this method. The second one is the flow quote. The speaker connected to her son by saying, "Life for me ain't been no crystal stair." Notice how in this sentence, it flows straight together so that you don't necessarily need the comma. And finally, you have the colon quote. In the poem, the mother tells her son that life has not been easy for her. You have the colon, and then life for me ain't been no crystal stair. The quote seeks to prove the sentence before it. So they're directly related to each other, but both of them could be independent clauses. You can only use a colon when you have an independent clause in the lead-in phrase. So, how do you recognize when you're using a dialogue quote? A dialogue quote is introduced by dialogue words, such as said, yelled, wondered, shouted, thought, claimed, announced. All of these words indicate that somebody is speaking. It also requires a comma to separate the dialogue word from the quote. Recognizing flow quotes. A flow quote naturally blends or flows into the text around it. It does not require punctuation prior to the quote or a capital letter at the beginning of the quote. Finally, recognizing colon quotes. A colon quote is introduced by a complete thought. They connect a full sentence lead-in phrase to a full sentence quote. Readers take a longer pause before a colon quote. To emphasize this pause, you need a colon and a capital letter after the colon. Recognizing complete versus incomplete lead-in phrases. When you're trying to use the colon quote, you need to have an independent clause prior to the colon. Try reading the phrase out loud. Identify independent versus dependent clauses. For example, the poem suggested that perseverance is essential. You could put a colon after that. That is a complete phrase. An incomplete phrase would be suggested that. You would have to add a few more words around that to make it make sense. A complete phrase would be, life is like running a race. You could put a colon after that, and then you could have the quote there. An incomplete phrase would be, running a race. Okay, to summarize, quotes or text evidence are essential in analytical writing. You must sandwich your quotes with context and an explanation or analysis of how the quote connects. And finally, there are 3 ways to embed quotes into your writing: dialogue quotes, flow quotes, and colon quotes.